My name is Owen, and this happened in February of 2023. That night, the blizzard had been forecast for days, but when it finally hit Duluth, it came down harder than anyone expected. Snow fell in thick, relentless waves, and the wind howled through the streets, piling drifts against doorways and burying cars up to their windows. The kind of storm that made you grateful for heat and four walls. I was alone in my rental, a small two-story house on a quiet block where everyone knew everyone, at least by sight. The houses were packed close, separated by narrow driveways and thin strips of frozen lawn. From my kitchen window, I could see straight into my neighbor's yard, and from the living room, I had a clear view of the street. It was the kind of place where you noticed when someone's porch light burned out. I'd spent most of the evening working from home, laptop open on the coffee table, half watching a documentary I wasn't really interested in. The heat was cranked up, and I had a mug of tea going cold beside me. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, everything felt sealed off and safe. Around 11, I got up to stretch my legs and glanced out the front window without thinking much of it. That's when I saw Mrs. Kovach. She lived 4 houses down, a woman in her late 60s who I'd seen maybe a dozen times in the 8 months I'd been here. Always polite, always bundled up in a thick winter coat even on mild days. The kind of person who shoveled her driveway before dawn and kept to herself. But now she was standing in the middle of the street, not walking, just standing, in the full force of the blizzard. No coat, no hat, nothing but a thin nightgown that whipped around her legs in the wind. Her arms hung at her sides. Her hair, gray and wild, was plastered to her head by the snow, but she didn't move to brush it away. She wasn't shivering, she wasn't hunched against the cold. She just stood there, facing my house. I felt my stomach tighten. The snow was coming down so thick I could barely make out her shape, but I could see her eyes. Or at least I thought I could. They seemed fixed, unblinking, locked on my window.
I stepped back instinctively, my breath fogging the glass. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe she was confused. Dementia, maybe. People wondered sometimes, especially at night. But something about the way she stood there felt deliberate, controlled, like she wanted to be seen. The wind tore at her nightgown, but she didn't sway, didn't stumble. She was planted in the snow like a statue, like something rooted to the earth that couldn't be moved. I pressed my face closer to the glass, squinting through the storm. The streetlights flickered, casting weak orange halos through the curtain of white. I could see the snow accumulating on her shoulders, on the top of her head, but she didn't brush it off, didn't move at all. Her skin looked pale, almost blue in the dim light, like old marble or something dredged from cold water. Her lips were parted slightly, like she was breathing, but I couldn't see her breath misting in the air, and it was well below zero out there. Had to be -15, maybe colder with the wind chill. The rational part of my brain was screaming explanations at me. She was sick, she needed help, she was having some kind of episode and I needed to call someone. But there was another part, deeper and older, that was screaming something else. Run, hide, don't let us see you. My heart started to pound, a heavy drum in my chest that made my hands shake. This wasn't right. People didn't stand in blizzards like this. They couldn't. The cold alone would drop someone in minutes, would shut down their extremities and send them into shock. But she just stood there, perfect and still. I grabbed my phone from the couch, thinking I'd call 911, tell them there was someone in distress. But when I looked back out the window, she moved. Not walked, moved. She was 5 feet closer to my house, still facing me, still perfectly still. Same posture, same angle, like someone had just picked her up and placed her in a new spot. I jerked back from the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. I hadn't seen her take a step, hadn't seen her shift her weight. She'd just been closer,
like a frame had been cut from a film. I told myself I'd blinked, that the snow had obscured her movement, but I knew I hadn't looked away, not for a second. I tried to rationalize it. The storm was disorienting, the light was bad, my eyes were playing tricks on me. But my hands were shaking as I unlocked my phone and started to dial. Then I stopped. But would I even say that my elderly neighbor was standing in a blizzard and I thought she'd teleported? They'd think I was drunk. Or worse, they'd send someone out into the storm and find nothing. Maybe she'd already gone back inside. Maybe I was losing it. I looked out the window again. She was still there, closer now, maybe 15 feet from my front steps. Her face was clearer now, and I could see that her expression hadn't changed. Blank, empty, not confused or lost, just waiting. I felt a cold knot form in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Then she smiled. Not a warm smile, not a confused smile. A wide, deliberate smile that stretched too far across her face, pulling at the corners of her mouth until I could see too many teeth, white and straight and somehow wrong. And she raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, each finger extending like she was conducting an orchestra. She pointed directly at me. Her finger was steady, unwavering, aimed at the center of my window like an accusation, or an invitation, or a promise. That's when I stumbled backward, my legs hitting the coffee table and nearly sending me sprawling. My mug hit the floor and shattered, tea spreading across the hardwood in a dark stain, but I barely registered it. My eyes were locked on her. She was still pointing, still smiling, and now I could see that her eyes weren't blinking, not once. The snow fell into them, melting on her lashes, streaming down her cheeks like tears, but she didn't flinch, didn't close them, just stared with that wide, unblinking gaze that pinned me like an insect to a board. I felt something primal kick in, that animal part of the brain that knows when you're being hunted.
My stomach went cold and my hands went numb, and I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. I scrambled to the light switch and killed the living room lights, plunging the room into darkness. Maybe if she couldn't see me, she'd go away. Maybe if I was invisible, I'd be safe. The logic was childish, but I didn't care. My breath came fast and shallow, fogging in front of my face, even though the house was warm. I could hear the wind howling outside, the rattle of the windows in their frames, the creak of the house settling under the weight of the storm and the cold. I pressed myself against the wall beside the window and peeked out through the edge of the curtain, just an inch of fabric pulled aside. She was still there, hands still raised, smile still fixed, but now she was at the bottom of my front steps, 3 steps from my door. I moved fast, my body acting before my mind caught up. I rushed to the front door and checked the deadbolt. Locked. I checked it again, then slid the chain into place. Then I went to the back door and did the same. Every window on the first floor, I checked the locks, the basement door, the side door to the garage, everything. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip the latches. I grabbed my phone again, and this time I did dial 911. The line rang, and rang, and rang. No answer. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the screen. Full signal. The call was going through, but no one was picking up. I tried again. Same thing. The storm must have knocked something out, overloaded the system. Or maybe I was the only one calling. Maybe no one else saw what I was seeing. I went back to the living room, staying low, and crept toward the window. I had to know if she was still there. I had to know if she'd moved again. I lifted the edge of the curtain with one finger and looked out. She was gone. The street was empty. Just snow and wind and the faint glow of the streetlights. I scanned the yards, the driveways, the spaces between the houses. Nothing. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived, because then I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock on my front door. The sound was so calm, so polite that it made everything worse. 3 slow knocks. Tap, tap, tap. Not frantic, not urgent, just patient, like someone who knew they had all the time in the world. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, staring at the door. The chain was still in place, the deadbolt was still turned, but the knocking came again. Tap, tap, tap. I forced myself to move, to cross the room on shaking legs, and I looked through the peephole. The distorted fisheye view showed me the front steps, the railing, the wall of snow beyond, but no one was there. No figure, no shadow, nothing. I held my breath and waited.
Silence. Then the knocking came again, and this time it was on the back door. My blood went cold. The back door was on the opposite side of the house, through the kitchen and down a short hallway. There was no way someone could move from the front to the back that fast, not in this storm, not through the drifts piled against the house. But the knocking was there, steady and calm. Tap, tap, tap. I backed away from the front door and moved toward the kitchen, my phone clutched in one hand like a weapon. The knocking stopped, and then I heard it upstairs. It was coming from the bedroom window. The same rhythm, tap, tap, tap. But the bedroom was on the second floor. There was no porch, no balcony, no ledge, nothing to stand on, just a sheer drop to the snow-covered lawn below. No tree branches close enough to reach, no trellis, no drain pipe, nothing. My mind screamed at me that this wasn't possible, but my body was already moving, driven by some terrible need to confirm what I already knew. I crept up the stairs, each step groaning under my weight despite my efforts to move quietly. The sound seemed deafening in the silence between the knocks. I kept my eyes locked on the bedroom door at the end of the hall, that rectangle of deeper darkness that seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart. The hallway felt longer than it should have been, stretching out like something from a dream or a nightmare. The knocking continued, steady, deliberate, patient. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone who knew I would eventually answer, like someone who had all the time in the world. I reached the doorway and stopped, pressing myself against the frame, my shirt sticking to my back with cold sweat. The bedroom was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains, creating shifting shadows that moved with the wind. I could see the window, the curtains shifting slightly in some draft I couldn't feel from where I stood. And then the knocking stopped. The silence was worse, so much worse. It pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight, broken only by the distant howl of the wind and my own ragged breathing. I waited, counting my heartbeats, feeling each one thud against my ribs. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. 10, 11, 12. Still nothing. I forced myself to move, to step inside the room, every muscle in my body coiled tight and screaming at me to run the other way. I crossed to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The glass was fogged from the temperature difference, creating a milky barrier between me and the outside world. I wiped it with my sleeve and peered out into the storm. The snow was still falling, thick and heavy, obscuring everything beyond 20 feet. I could make out the swirling white, the dark shapes of the neighboring houses, the skeletal forms of bare trees bending in the wind. But no one was there. No ladder, no footprints in the snow on the roof, nothing. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and closed my eyes, trying to slow my breathing, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. And that's when I felt it. A hand, ice cold and impossibly strong, closing around my ankle. I screamed and kicked, throwing myself backward, but the grip held for a split second before releasing. I crashed onto the floor, scrambling away from the bed, my back hitting the wall. My eyes darted to the space beneath the bed frame, to the shadows pooled there, but I couldn't see anything. The room was a mess of darkness and faint light, every corner a potential threat. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the window in its frame, and I realized I couldn't trust my senses anymore. I grabbed the bedside lamp and ripped it from the wall, holding it like a club as I moved toward the door. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and too loud, and underneath it, something else, a faint scraping sound, like nails on wood, coming from somewhere below me, from the first floor.
I stumbled into the hallway and looked down the stairs. The living room was still dark, but I could see movement. A shape, pale and thin, passing in front of the window. Then another, and another. 3 figures now, all in nightgowns, all standing in my yard, all facing the house. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I knew they were smiling. I knew they were waiting. And I knew with a certainty that turned my stomach that the doors wouldn't hold. I ran back into the bedroom and slammed the door, shoving the dresser in front of it with strength I didn't know I had. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, and I heard the front door rattle on its hinges, not like someone was trying to break it down, like something was testing it, feeling for weakness. I looked around the room, desperate for options. The window, I could break it, climb out onto the roof, maybe drop into the snowdrift below. It was a long fall, but better than staying here. I grabbed a chair and swung it at the window. The glass splintered but didn't break. I swung again, harder, and this time it shattered outward, the cold air rushing in like a physical blow. Snow swirled into the room, stinging my face, but I didn't care. I knocked out the remaining shards and looked down. The drop was worse than I'd thought, at least 15 feet to the ground, and the snow below was packed hard from the wind. But I could hear the dresser scraping across the floor behind me. The door was opening. I climbed onto the windowsill, the cold biting through my clothes, my socks already soaked. I looked back once and saw the door swing wide, and in the darkness beyond, I saw her, Mrs. Kovach.
She stepped into the room, her movement smooth and unnatural, her smile wider than any human smile should be. And behind her, 2 more figures. I didn't wait. I jumped. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I hit the snowdrift hard, my shoulder taking most of the force, and pain exploded down my arm. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just lay there gasping in the snow while the blizzard raged around me. Above me, I saw the broken window, and in it, 3 faces looking down, watching, not following, just watching. I forced myself to my feet, ignoring the pain, and I ran. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind shoved me sideways, but I kept moving. I didn't know where I was going. Away. I was all that mattered. I stumbled through my neighbor's yard, then the next, my vision blurred by snow and tears. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they were made of lead. But I didn't stop. I made it to the corner and looked back. My house was just a dark shape in the storm now, the broken window barely visible. The figures were gone. The street was empty. But I knew they were still there, waiting. I turned and kept running, and I didn't stop until I saw the lights of the gas station 3 blocks away. I burst through the door, soaked and shaking, and the clerk behind the counter stared at me like I'd just crawled out of a grave. The clerk called the police, and they came within 20 minutes, which felt like a miracle given the storm. 2 officers, skeptical but professional, took my statement while I sat wrapped in a scratchy blanket someone had pulled from a back room. I told them everything. The woman in the street, the knocking, the hand on my ankle, the figures in my yard. I watched their faces as I spoke, saw the subtle shifts in expression, the micro-glances they exchanged, the kind that said they thought I was either on something or having a breakdown. Maybe both. But they were professionals. They nodded and took notes and asked clarifying questions in calm, measured tones. Had I been drinking? No. Taken any medication? No. Any history of mental health issues? No. Had I seen these people before? Yes, one of them, Mrs. Kovach, from down the street. They wrote it all down, and then they asked if I wanted them to check the house. I said yes, please. One of them stayed with me while the other went out to his cruiser to radio for backup. Protocol, he explained. They don't enter potentially dangerous situations alone. I waited at the station while they went. They'd insisted on it, said it was safer, said they'd call me when they were done. It felt like hours, but it was probably less than 1. I sat in a plastic chair in the lobby, still wearing the blanket, watching the clock on the wall tick forward with excruciating slowness. Every time the door opened, I jumped. Every time the phone rang, my heart stopped.
When they finally came back, their expressions had changed. One of them, a younger guy with a thin mustache and nervous eyes, looked pale, shaken. The other, older and heavier, with the kind of face that had seen everything, wouldn't meet my eyes when he spoke. They'd found the broken window. They'd found footprints in the snow leading up to my house, multiple sets, bare feet, in the middle of a blizzard, but no sign of anyone inside. No damage except what I'd done when I jumped. No evidence of forced entry. The doors were still locked from the inside. The chain was still in place on the front door. They asked if I wanted to go back. I said no, not tonight, maybe not ever. They asked if I had somewhere else to stay. I said I'd figure it out. They offered to drive me to a motel, and I accepted. The older one drove, and neither of us spoke during the ride. When we pulled up to the motel on the edge of town, he turned to me and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Stay away from that house. Whatever you saw, it wasn't meant for you to see, and you don't want to see it again." Then he drove off, and I checked in with shaking hands. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the bed with the lights on and stared at the door until the sun came up. The next day, the storm had passed. The sky was pale and clear, the streets buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. I went back to the house with a friend, someone I'd called from work who didn't ask too many questions. We went inside together. Everything looked normal. The broken window had been temporarily covered by the police with plastic sheeting. The dresser was still shoved against the bedroom door, but there was nothing else. No signs of intrusion, no footprints inside, nothing missing, nothing disturbed. I packed a bag and left. I broke my lease 2 weeks later, paying the penalty without argument. I moved across town to a building with security cameras and a doorman. I told myself I'd overreacted, that the storm had messed with my head, that maybe I'd had some kind of episode, but I knew better. I'd seen what I'd seen, felt what I'd felt. I asked around about Mrs. Kovach, carefully, trying not to sound insane. One of the neighbors, an older man who'd lived on the block for decades, gave me a strange look. He told me Mrs. Kovach had died 3 years ago, heart attack, in her sleep, in the middle of winter. He asked me why I was asking. I told him I'd just been curious. I never went back to that street again. It's been almost 3 years now, and I still think about that night. Not every day anymore, but often enough. I've tried to rationalize it, to find explanations that make sense. Carbon monoxide, stress-induced hallucinations, sleep deprivation, but none of it fits. I wasn't tired. The detectors in the house were working, and the police found those footprints, bare feet in the snow. That part was real. I don't talk about it much. The few people I've told either think I'm lying or look at me with a kind of pitying concern that's worse than disbelief. So I keep it to myself. But it changed me. I don't live alone anymore. I can't. I make sure every door and window is locked before I go to bed, and I check them twice, 3 times. I avoid blizzards when I can, and when I can't, I stay inside with every light in the apartment on. Sometimes, late at night when the wind picks up, I find myself standing at the window, looking out at the street, watching for figures that shouldn't be there, listening for knocking that doesn't come. I tell myself I'm being paranoid, but paranoia is just fear with a memory, and I remember everything. Last winter, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. There was silence on the other end, just the faint sound of wind, then a voice, distant and crackling like a bad connection. It said my name, just once, Owen, and then the line went dead. I checked the number later. It was from Duluth, from the area code of my old neighborhood. I haven't been back. I don't plan to. But I wonder sometimes if they're still there, standing in the snow, waiting at the doors, watching the windows. I wonder if someone else has moved into that house, if they've seen what I saw, if they ran or if they didn't. I wonder if Mrs. Kovach is still out there, smiling that too wide smile, patient and unblinking. I don't have answers. I don't think I ever will. Some things don't have explanations, and some nights don't have endings. They just stop, and you carry them with you, like a scar you can't see but always feel. That's what I live with now. Not fear, exactly, but the knowledge that the world is stranger and colder than I ever wanted to believe, and that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.